I was asked to talk more about the intellectual property and the broad frameworks of medicines and the TRIPS agreement and so on. I think Leena will be talking more about the waiver. I will, mention that in passing, but I thought that that's the way we had divided the issue. So I won't be hopefully stepping on Leena's toes. So yeah, I thought that as a way of getting us into this discussion, it would be useful to put out some of the questions which I thought around which we could of course, intellectual property might not be a topic which is familiar to everybody. I'm sure there are some fairly experienced journalists here who have an idea and have a fair idea of what's involved there. But we thought that we should be inclusive and pitch it so that everybody who is relatively new to this field would be able to appreciate what's going on. So those are the kinds of questions that I thought we might frame the discussion around. And I think given the tight leash that Marlies has put us on, we probably won't be able to get to all of that, but I thought I would get through at least 3 or 4 of those sort of topics there. And then we could pick up on some of the other issues in the question and answer session and in further discussion. So I just want to start by, raising this question of what is intellectual property and sharing this visual with you to sort of give you a sense of, these are symbols that are pretty, I think, familiar to most people. It's something that we are encountering on a sort of very daily basis. And when one sees that, one identifies these symbols with particular products, without really knowing that, of course, there's intellectual property that protects these products in particular ways and how that might impact our lives. So if you look, for example, I think for many of you who are journalists, that big C with the circle around it is probably a very familiar sign. Anybody in the publishing business would know that that sign represents a particular type of intellectual property, and that is the copyright, right? And what this indicates is that that particular product is, the creative product is protected from unauthorized use. And good examples of this are, whether it's newspapers, electronic content, film, books, artworks, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's a fairly common and easy one that I think we get quite often. The other one that you will notice, of course, on the bottom left and the top right, again, not obviously universally popular signs, but ones that do catch the eye, the swoosh of the Nike company, and of course the Coca-Cola sign. And again, these are symbols which identify that particular trader's goods as being very distinctive. Nobody else owns it, nobody else can, use it and capitalize on it, as it were. And those are usually referred to as a particular kind of intellectual property, and that is trademarks. Then if you look at that fancy kind of desk thing on the right, it's an example of the kind of products that are protected in terms of the design manufacture and so on, right? In this case, I think that's a computer desk, but that is protected by what is known as an industrial design. There are other good examples of of products which have the protection of industrial design, such as the iPod. And in the case of something that's very current, machines like ventilators, for example, are also protected by this particular type of intellectual property. And then, of course, when you look at that picture of the pills, just to remind us that there's no sign for patent, but there's to remind us that this product is an invention which is protected in a particular way, and its protection is to exclude other people from manufacturing it, from using it, from selling it, and so on. And that protection is known as a patent. So I think broadly, these are the main kind of intellectual property protections we would find on products of everyday use. Of course, we will sort of hone in a little bit on the medicines, which I think are a big concern here. So if you take any medical product, it is subject to usually at least a patent and maybe a bunch of other intellectual property protections as well. So if you, for example, take a prescription from your doctor and go to the pharmacist for a product called Viagra, for example, you will be dispensed that little box of blue pills, or so I'm told. That is a product which is usually protected by patent. I'm told that the patent on this expired fairly recently, but until the patent was in force, it was protected in a very strict and stringent way. So, for example, if you decided that you, in addition to your career as a journalist, you wanted to start a laboratory in your kitchen, making medicines for erectile dysfunction, then if you did that, you would be infringing Pfizer's patent on this, and they could sue you and possibly, invoke all sorts of other actions on you. So you can see that that product is protected by a patent. But then if you look at the box itself, and you'll find that usually that kind of product by that company will have some kind of sign. And in this case, I think it's Pfizer, which has got a kind of elliptical sign with Pfizer written in it, blue background, I think, yeah. And this is the trademark that Pfizer actually holds over this. So this is another intellectual property that attaches to this particular product. And if you decided that you are going to, in the product that you're making in your kitchen or laboratory, is going to have a similar kind of symbol on it, you're in trouble because you'd be violating the trademark. And then just the third sort of example on this particular product, if you look inside the box, usually medicines have what is called a package insert, right? A piece of paper with a lot of details in very fine print, which most of us who are semi-blind will never be able to read, but it contains a lot of information, both scientific information, information about use, and so on and so on. That package insert is also protected, and this time by a copyright, so that if you, in your product, decide to photocopy that and stick it into the box and so on, you will be infringing their copyright. So you can see that so one product is protected by a range of different intellectual property rules and intellectual property protections, which in a way maintain the very strong hold that the owner, the manufacturer, has over this sort of product, and which makes it that much more difficult for anybody who wants to imitate or copy from doing so. So this next slide, I've already, it's very fine print. I apologize. Just what I explained. So I won't, be going into any detail on this, but just to say that in addition to those intellectual property protections that I mentioned just now, trademarks, copyright, designs, and patents, there's also a lot of other knowledge behind these products that is not usually known to the public, what is known as undisclosed information. And later when Leena talks about the waiver, she will make some reference to this because that is a very big part of what is being asked for in the waiver proposal. And here we're talking about the clinical trial data that attaches to a product, biological resources, industry know-how, and importantly, things like trade secrets, the formulas and the processes and designs and so on that accompany this product, which have economic value and which the owner is not, of course, happy to share with anybody. But most importantly, the problem with that, of course, is that it makes it difficult for people to reproduce those products if they don't have access to that information. So I think that is really the all I want to say this far about what is intellectual property, how it's working when it comes to medicines. And let me then just move on to the second kind of question, and that is to talk about what is the intellectual property framework in terms of which we work, right? So I'm guessing that most of you are based in South Africa, so you know that South Africa has a Patents Act, it has a Trademarks Act, Designs Act, Copyright Act, various other pieces of legislation that deals with intellectual property, and has had it for a long time. And the history of this, simply in a very short hand, is that before around 1994, every country had the freedom to decide how it was going to manage its intellectual property business, right? And what we had was a diversity of rules across countries about intellectual property. So for example, just two examples. One, of course, is that how long should a patent last for, right? Some countries had provisions which allowed for 7 years, others 10, others 15, some had 20, right? So you saw that, in fact, countries had this kind of freedom before 1994. The other example, of course, is countries also had the freedom to decide what would be protected by a patent and what inventions would not be protected. So for example, countries like India and a few others had exempted medicines from being, medical products from being protected by patents right until, well, 2005. So in a sense, they had a lot more flexibility and freedom and so on, and they could actually design their industrial policies and so on in accordance with this freedom that they had and policy space, as they say, that they had. All that changed in '94 when the World Trade Organization was established, and in January 1995, the TRIPS agreement came into operation. So the TRIPS stands for trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. There's a very interesting history behind this. We don't have time to go into this, how it came about and so on. But effectively, what happened here was that the big IP-rich countries, so in other words, countries which housed those big multinational corporations which had strong interest in IP, like the motion picture industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, and various other industries, made a big push for getting a harmonized system of intellectual property in place, right? And that's why we have the TRIPS agreement. So what did that give us? In essence, 3 or 4 key things. The first is that it gave us a one-size-fits-all approach. So whereas previously we had diversity, now we had a single system where everybody had to comply with minimum standards, right? What it also required us to do was that everybody had to grant patents on products and on processes. So that took care of the freedom that India had to not patent medical products before that. Right? And most importantly, I'm doing a very short hand of this TRIPS agreement, is that everybody had to abide by a minimum of 20 years of protection. So I think that has been also because previously countries had a lot more freedom and could protect them for shorter periods of time, which meant that at the end of the protection period, competitors could enter the market. In other words, when the patent lapsed, they could enter the market, they could copy, they could produce, they could compete. Right? So that freedom was taken away. So the effect of all of this is that what this form of high level of intellectual property protection does is that it excludes competition, because the patent in particular, and other rights as well, are exclusive rights. What they do is that they give the holder of the right to make sure that everybody is out of the room. It's excluded from copying or manufacturing or using or selling any of that stuff. And of course, this fact then enables monopolies to be formed, right? Where there's a single supplier, single producer, single supplier who can call the shots, who can decide, name the price. And that is the prices that will go for those particular problems. Obviously, this gives rise to what we call access problems. If prices are too high, they're unaffordable, it means that the majority of the people in the world are not able to pay for, afford, and access those particular products. In the TRIPS agreement, there are also some provisions which are sort of safeguards, or flexibilities is the popular term for this, such as exemptions from patenting, exceptions to patent rights, parallel importation, and all that. We could, of course, in Q&A go into more detailed explanations about that. Here, I just want to say that one important flexibility is what is known as a compulsory license. And I'll have a little more to say about that in a moment. But just to say that in order to understand what a compulsory license is, I think we need to understand what is a voluntary license. Right? And you can understand that these are sort of oppositional terms. So in the course of business, it happens that a holder of a patent, and therefore the control of the product, will license the manufacture of that product to some other company or entity, right? On a voluntary basis. In other words, they agree to do that. And usually that will come with certain terms and conditions which are attached to that license, right? And that can be quite strict, conditions. But the commonest conditions would be I license you, I give you a voluntary license, and you pay me a royalty on all the product that you actually sell. So that does actually happen often. And of course, you know, the holders of patents have reasons why they do this, and they have reasons why they do not do this quite often. More often than not, where they have control of a market, they have market share, they want to ensure that they redeem all the profits from that market, they will be reluctant to enter into voluntary agreements. And therefore, the flexibility then comes into play, or it becomes available, where a government usually is the authority that can issue a compulsory license. In other words, giving a company a license to manufacture that particular product without the consent of the patent holder, right? So the voluntary one is with their consent, and the compulsory license is without the consent. And of course, that is a very complicated sort of area with a lot of, you know, opposition from all sides and so on, which I'll talk about in a moment.
Yousuf, I'm going to be very cruel. You have 2 more minutes.
Okay, well, I'll do what I can in 2 minutes, right? The one thing that I think is interesting to know is that the way a patent is granted also impacts on how strong or not that the patent right is. So usually a patent will be examined to ensure that it meets all the standards that are required by law. But in South Africa, we don't have an examination system. So if you look along the left column there, we have what is known as a depository system. The patent is merely filed, money is paid, the forms are filled, and usually a patent is granted. The result of this is that a lot of patents which are not deserving, which are not really innovative, get granted, and they make it difficult for generic competition, for people to enter the market, compete, and make products available. In the last minute that I have, I'll just talk briefly about the barriers to compulsory licensing. In the 100 or so years of patent legislation that we have had in South Africa, there has not been a single compulsory license granted on a pharmaceutical. There are broadly 3 reasons for this, and I'll go to that quickly. The one is that the Patents Act, 2 problems in particular. One is that there are very limited grounds on which one can bring an application for a compulsory license. And secondly, it involves a judicial process. Go to court, engage expensive lawyers, take years, and that's the only way you can go through that process. And of course, on the legal aspect, there's also the question of judicial deference. Our judges, our courts have been very reluctant to grant compulsory licenses. They tend to defer to patent holders. And not only you know, previously, but even in the constitutional era, we've had as recently as 2019, a constitutional court judgment couldn't find a decent decision you know, on patents. The economic reasons, only big companies have deep pockets that they can afford to litigate for years on end. Small manufacturers, generic companies don't have that. They therefore stay away from it. And finally, there are political barriers, and that is that governments fear that they lose political capital, that in trade negotiations, they get clobbered on the head because they are not protecting and enforcing patent rights. And there are trade and other sorts of pressures as well. There's more about this, which is about what options that are possible in the South African context, which I can pick up on later. So I'm going to stop there.
Yousuf, thank you so much, and I'm sorry that I'm being such a tyrant. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get to some of the content during the Q&A, and I want to just inform all the participants that we will be sharing the slides after the event. So thank you very much, Yousuf, for that informative input. The next speaker is Zain. Zain, if you would like to switch your camera on and ready your slides. Zain is a researcher, a policy researcher at Public Citizen, and he focuses on pharmaceutical innovation and access to medicines. Zain, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Yousuf, for that very helpful overview. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on understanding the role of the public sector in developing these vaccines, and also tie it back to some of the access issues and patent issues and IP issues that were raised previously. So this is what the world looks like. You know, I'm sure many of you know this better than me, that there are serious gaps in access to vaccines. You have a number of countries. This is a slide, by the way, from UNICEF, or the graphic, sorry, is from UNICEF, their market dashboard. You have a number of rich countries that have bought up supply. There are a few global initiatives now. COVAX has bought some supply. The African Union has bought some supply. But for the most part, there are serious disparities in vaccine access. And there are disparities both in volume. As you may know, COVAX only aims to provide enough vaccines for about 20 to 27% of low and middle income countries.
Sorry, Zain, as the tyrant facilitator here, we can't see your slides. Would you be able to share your screen?
I thought I did. Okay, let me try again. Okay, there we go. That's better. Can you see now?
We can, yeah. And if you can put on presentation view,
sure.
Then we could see it even better.
Sure.
Perfect.
Sorry about that.
Thank
so yeah,
you,
this is the graph I was talking about. There are disparities, and so for example, COVAX is an initiative to provide access to low and middle income countries, but its aim in 2021 is to provide access to 20 to 27% of low and middle income countries. And that is, you know, miles away from what we need to get herd immunity. You know, we don't know the exact precise number, but scientists estimate it's around 70 to 80%. And it also is likely going to be a fraction of where the rich countries are going to be. And so there are going to be huge gaps. You know, I think in the US, for example, I think, and this is, you know, prediction, so much depends on production volume, et cetera, but I think it's safe to say that by the end of the summer, most people who want to be vaccinated will be able to get vaccinated, most adults. And when that becomes true for the rest of the world, we don't really know. And that is a cause for serious concern, because this pandemic, as you know, is tied to so much. There were, you know, the head of the European Investment Bank talked about how this pandemic means it's a question of stability. You know, it can become a question of war and peace. Those are the words of the European Investment Bank. There was a study done by the International Chamber of Commerce that the world economy could lose trillions of dollars without global access. There is increasing recognition of just how important this pandemic is and what it's doing. You all know better than I do the kind of devastating toll the South African variant is having, and particularly by even senior level political officials are starting to die in significant number all around Southern Africa. So this is the map of vaccine access. And this is what it looks like, right? This is from The Economist from I believe a couple of weeks ago, talking about who can get access when and what their estimates are. And these are of course all estimates. And that's one thing to always flag, is that there is uncertainty as to when particular vaccine access, you know, when countries will get particular vaccine access. And even, you know, it's worth keeping in mind that the production volumes that the companies say they'll be able to produce also should have like a big asterisk beside it, because they don't really know, right? That's their best case projection about how many doses they can get. But in many cases, as we've seen with the European Union, for example, with AstraZeneca being slower to deliver, sometimes these estimates are wrong. And so this is one estimate into what vaccine access will look like, which is a huge cause for concern. And these are some of the figures and stats I had mentioned before. You know, one of the most pressing issues of global justice there is right now at this moment. So I apologize for the tiny slide here, but before I get into the content of the slide, I think it's really helpful to build on Yousuf's presentation and talk about what is it exactly that's at issue here, right? And so, and this is going to sound very philosophical and abstract, but I promise I can make it simpler. What really is at issue here is information. And what is information? You know, it sounds like a philosopher, but it's about knowledge. It's about, you know, in a simpler way to understand it, it's about the recipe. And what makes information or knowledge or the recipe different is that if someone comes up with the recipe and then they share the recipe, they don't lose the recipe themselves. They don't forget suddenly, right? It's not like, it's not a zero-sum game. And so there's an ability to share information with really no diminution in the knowledge that you have yourself, right? Or in the information you have in yourself. And so that's what makes a lot of these issues very unique. And that's what actually adds to the injustice of all this. Because a dose of a vaccine, for example, can be only used by one person. But the knowledge about how to make a vaccine can be used by everyone, right? It can be used by any vaccine producer in the world, or any even pharmaceutical manufacturer in the world, if they, you know, were to re-equip and retool and repurpose their facilities. And so what patents do and what intellectual property does in various ways is restrict that information. It restricts the recipe. It either allows companies to just keep the recipe completely secret and just say, you know, we're not sharing the recipe, or intellectual property actually says, even if you find the recipe yourself, you can't use it. So even if you find the recipe and we hold a patent, then we as the patent holder can restrict you from using it. And of course, governments have the ultimate control here, right? The governments set the patent law, and they can change these patent laws and various other intellectual property laws to make to suit their public health goals, et cetera. And then there's the overarching framework of TRIPS. And so that's kind of the lay of the land in the most general sense. And what makes this especially egregious is that one common refrain from industry that you'll hear is, well, we need patents, we need intellectual property because that's our incentive, right? We need incentives to develop the information, we need incentives to invest in research and development. But that explanation actually crumbles when you look at how much of the work is funded by the public. And so this is where this slide comes in. These are some of the leading candidates, and some of them have gotten emergency use authorization, some have not yet, but are poised to. And what you'll see is there's really huge amounts of money from the public that have gone into these candidates. You look at, for example, the so-called Moderna vaccine, which is actually properly known as the NIH Moderna vaccine, the NIH referring to the National Institutes of Health in the US, which is the US government institution, which actually helped design the vaccine, helped invent the vaccine. There's AstraZeneca Oxford, which came out of Oxford, and then got, you know, huge sums of money just from the US government alone, 1.6 billion. There's also the J&J vaccine, which is 50% was funded by US taxpayers. Like that's in the agreement, that's 50%, 50-50. There's the Novavax vaccine, which again, huge sums of money just from the US government, plus another organization called CEPI, which is one of the institutions behind COVAX. The Pfizer vaccine was a little bit different. It got an advanced purchase commitment. They basically de-risked it. So the US government said, if you come up with your vaccine, and if it gets FDA approval, no matter how it compares to anyone else, we'll still buy, you know, 100 million doses at the beginning. And then finally, there's the Sanofi GSK one. And what makes it really, and so again, going back to the original idea of the recipe. So in this case, the recipe was largely funded by taxpayers. And so the asymmetry is that the public, the people, the taxpayers paid for these corporations to come up with the recipe. And then when they came up with the recipe, they got to keep it as a secret. So in most cases, taxpayers have not gotten sufficient public interest protections. You could imagine a world, for example, in which the US government told the companies, okay, we'll give you the $1.6 billion, which is, you know, a ton of money. We'll give you the $1.6 billion, but as a result, you know, you have to share the recipe. or you have to make this knowledge public, you have to share the intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. And the final thing I'll say on this slide also is that there's the extent, the contribution just goes beyond money as well. In a lot of the cases, some of the foundational science is actually funded by taxpayers too. And so the U.S. government and other other public institutions around the world have done a lot of work into, for example, mRNA technology. This was an idea that's been floated around since the 90s. And a lot of the foundational work into, well, how do we actually make mRNA vaccines, or not even vaccines actually, but how do we just make the idea of mRNA work? And that has been funded by taxpayers as well. And finally, some of the latest science, and I know I'm running a bit late on time, so I'll try to rush now, but coronaviruses are called coronaviruses because when you look at them under a microscope or electron microscope, you see that they have little crowns. And the crowns basically refer to the spike protein. There's a little spike on the virus. And one of the problems with the spike is that you want the vaccine to basically produce, something that looks like that basically replicates that spike, because that produces the immune response you want. But the spike protein is unstable, so it quickly changes shape. So if you produce just the spike protein, it kind of it doesn't work that well. And it was actually federal government and the federal scientists who figured out how to stabilize and how to freeze the spike protein in the right shape a long time ago. And so as a result, a lot of the vaccines build on this years of decades of coronavirus research and use that same modification in the spike protein. And so this is another example of just how foundational the US government and public taxpayers' role has been, whether it's CEPI, the US government, the EU, National Institutes of Health, it's the NIH Moderna vaccine. It's not just the Moderna vaccine. And we went through some contracts at Moderna and the US government. We found that Moderna has to disclose how much of its project, which was funded by the US government vis-a-vis the company itself. And what we found was pretty remarkable, because Moderna basically said that the 100% of the project was funded by the US government, and the project was referring to pretty much everything from phase 2 onwards. And we know that NIH and CEPI did phase 1 and preclinical work. And so the entire development, you can see from preclinical development all the way to phase 3, that has just been public money at each step of the way, which is pretty astonishing, because this is one of the companies that has sold the vaccine for the highest prices. And so when we found some of this information, the US government many officials were like, yes, we should be transparent, we should say, but it's still, I think, consistently neglected just how crucial public funding is. And this slide is a bit dated now, but these are some of the sales that Moderna has made, and the US government has actually bought more supply now as well. But you can see just how, public money goes in for private profits. And so what's the solution? And this is how I'll wrap up. It's about the recipe, right? It's about making sure that the recipe is shared as widely as possible, so every manufacturer who can does end up making coronavirus vaccines. And this is an op-ed from Tedros, the head of the WHO, the DG, the World Health Organization. And he talks about some of these issues about openly sharing vaccine manufacturing technology, intellectual property know-how through a WHO mechanism. He also refers to the World Trade Organizations temporarily waiving intellectual property barriers. And the idea is that once you clear away these barriers, you can ramp up production. And this is just very briefly, I'll touch on the Trade Organization, and this is a slide that shows its membership. And so you have this kind of global institution which sets minimum standards for countries to follow when it comes to issues related to intellectual property. And then you look at the slide of vaccine access, right? Like it's a different world. It doesn't really make sense for countries that have, vastly different socioeconomic development levels, vastly different kind of public health needs, to be following a set of uniform standards and not fully utilizing the flexibilities they have. And so I'll just stop there and say that, we've done a lot of work in the US focused on what the US government can do instead of just, instead of actively blocking some of the WTO work and being an impediment like the Trump administration has. We're hopeful that the Biden administration, for example, can actually take an affirmative role. And what that means is, really champion the idea that we can do things differently. We can mobilize the world to think differently, more boldly, share the vaccine recipe, especially because so much of it has been funded by taxpayers, and make sure that there's no, and share the intellectual property and support the WTO waiver so there's no intellectual property issues, and then finally build manufacturing capacity so we can ramp up supply as much as possible, as quickly as possible all around the world. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions after Leena's presentation.
Zain, thank you very much. That was excellent. I'm going to ask Leena if she could switch on her camera and share her slides. Leena is the South Asia head of the MSF's Access campaign. Leena, can you see us?
Yes, I can see you all.
Okay, excellent. And are you doing your own slides, or is Tiwa doing it for you?
If you could do it for me, that would be really great.
Okay. Tiwa, is that okay? I see Tiwa's screen is busy sharing. That's looking good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tiwa. Please take it away, Leena.
Yeah, so firstly, I wanted to say that I work with Doctors Without Borders. I've spent the last 19 years of my life working as a civil rights lawyer, predominantly within the community of drug users, people living with HIV and hepatitis C. And I think the subaltern and marginalized communities have always been very close to my heart because of my work with Doctors Without Borders, where we actually treat refugees and marginalized communities, but also because my brother has been a drug user, and I've seen a lot of these issues up close and personal. I'm also part of the women's rights movement, and I have worked in South Africa on the patent law reform, and I feel very home in South Africa. Very few countries actually bring that element out in me, and I feel that, and somehow South Africa and India are very, very connected in our politics, in society, and the way we perceive the world. So I'm going to talk about intellectual property from a, people's perspective, and how do people perceive the intellectual property system, particularly in countries where marginalized communities and people of color live. So the next slide. Yeah. So I'm just going to briefly describe the work that Doctors Without Borders or Access Campaign does. It's a specialized unit of people with different disciplines. And we've really worked hard on looking at unaffordable, when you have existing treatments and they're just not affordable. They may be diagnostics, they may be drugs, they may be vaccines. The pneumonia vaccine, for example, is something that we work extensively on, antiretrovirals, and of course, drug-resistant tuberculosis. And something that's really very expensive in South Africa is the hepatitis B drugs, which we have in the generic form in India. So you constantly have a back and forth on existing medicines, which are very, very expensive. Of course, many a times you just don't have appropriate drugs or diagnostics for neglected diseases, but actually they are neglected populations, because no matter how much intellectual property you create, it doesn't solve the problem of attracting R&D. And then, of course, plain simple is unsuitable. And Pfizer's vaccine is just a classical example, where Moderna and Pfizer developed a vaccine that pretty much was, seen as, well, they just said we were not ready for it, and your supply chains don't exist. So it was a very convenient way of moving out of the responsibility of supplying vaccines to the world, and the minus 72 and so on requirements of extreme cold chain made it very convenient for them to use the unsuitability criteria to rule out access in developing countries. We've seen that many a times. We've seen this with lopinavir, ritonavir, the HIV drug. It was a capsule that would leak. And therefore, we work on all these different aspects. So the next slide. Yeah. So I think right around the time South Africa gained independence, the globalization of patent rules also happened. And that was 1995, countries joined the WTO, they signed the TRIPS agreement, and everyone was tied into the 20-year monopoly system, irrespective of whether, they had 7-year systems, they didn't have product patents before, and there was no differentiation between life-saving medicines and trivial goods, and the IP that could be, sort of created and monopolized out of that. And of course, the only deferment was for least developing countries. So the next slide. Yeah. So if you look at the market structure of what does intellectual property really do, and I'm not just talking about patents, you can apply the same rule for data exclusivity, which luckily for us in South Africa and India, we don't have. You have a monopoly system, or sometimes you even have a duopoly, like we are seeing with AstraZeneca and Serum Institute. You have, just a single supplier, and you have very little competition, and you just have to import that particular product at whatever price Big Pharma really wants to offer it to you. You don't really have much say in it, unless, of course, you invoke different pressure tactics, such as South Africa did in the case of antiretrovirals by, the competition commission stepping in. So, the structure is very static. You can't get out of it unless you change the way, change the rules for COVID-19. So you're going to be stuck in this system where, you may have countries where there are no patents, having multiple suppliers, but then not being able to reach countries who have patents, and therefore, having very high prices of medicines. Now, the exception now is that even manufacturing countries like India, who in the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic did not have intellectual property monopolies, are now tied in by the globalized system of the TRIPS agreement. So the next slide. So this is just the classic thing that happened. We had to fight for each drug by drug. And, as much as HIV/AIDS treatment with 5 million people living with HIV on treatment in South Africa today, and 10 million in India, what people have forgotten how difficult it was to get even a single drug. And this is the fluconazole. Even before antiretrovirals, people had these life-threatening opportunistic infections. And of course, you can see the South Africa price. This is per tablet. And South Africa was just not able to buy fluconazole for its people. Number of Fatima's comrades actually flew to Thailand to buy the generic, and actually, flouted the intellectual property regime to get treatments to the people. So, you have the classic case of HIV/AIDS where we had to fight it out drug by drug. So the next slide. Yeah, so you had, people have forgotten, we've lived through an epidemic before. You had 40 million people with HIV. You had treatments that cost $15,000 per year. No one could afford them, excepting Brazil, Thailand, India, who had generic capacity almost, which is actually being mirrored even today. If you look at, today India has the capacity to produce these vaccines. No one practically could have those antiretrovirals. And you had 8,000 people a day dying, and I can't imagine what the toll is for COVID-19. And this is exactly the situation in 2000, 2001, when we had to confront patents at our competition commissions and other authorities, and of course, our governments. So the next slide. So what did we do? We got around in the WTO because we needed consensus, because every time we moved, every time we wanted to purchase generic antiretrovirals, because they were, much cheaper, and I'll come to those prices, we were coerced by bilateral pressure, either through the United States. Brazil faced immense pressure on not exporting its antiretrovirals that it produced. Similarly, Indian companies were faced with legal notices. And I think what really built consensus, the process that South Africa and many other countries led to a consensus at the WTO, which is pretty much what we're asking for today in a way. A declaration was passed that recognized that countries could act in public interest and protect health and provide access to medicines for all. The first example, of course, for that was HIV/AIDS. But it did not tweak the rules in any way. It did not waive the requirement to grant patents. And that itself caused immense hardship, because if you look at the body of work that MSF has done, and I've been for 15 years in, but MSF has started the access campaign in India. What have we been doing? We've been finding the patents on antiretrovirals and hepatitis C and TB. We identify the claims, we take it to our organic chemists, we find weaknesses in the claims. We go back to legal aid organizations like Lawyers Collective, we draft the oppositions, we file them before the patent offices. If we win, that drug goes into generic competition. I mean, that's been the trajectory from tenofovir to dolutegravir. It's a very, I would say, resource-intensive and time-intensive process, and that's just in one country. So you have to replicate it in Ukraine, Brazil, and many other countries. So this is really, I would say, the starting point at the WTO, but it definitely wasn't the final solution, I would say, at the WTO. So the next slide. So what did it do? It at least for HIV/AIDS, it allowed countries to issue some compulsory licenses, and you saw the flow of generic medicines going from India to a number of other developing countries. Prices fell very quickly from $10,439, which was a charitable price, which is, that's what I call the AstraZeneca price, the $3 a dose price. You could bring it down much further, our experience tells us. And it's now down to about $80 to $90 per patient per year. And I haven't updated this slide from 06, but they are, the data is updated. So it just clearly shows how competition works. You have one originator above $10,000, and then comes Brazil at 2,700, then comes Cipla at 350, and then you've got multiple suppliers. And from 2000 to July 2006, you have countries are scaling up. But in COVID-19, we don't have those 6 years. We really have to just completely shorten the period within which we do this, right? So I think this is where I think the challenge lies. And the next slide. In many other therapeutic areas, we were not able to do that. Imatinib, which is a life-saving cancer drug. When I was in South Africa, I met so many cancer patients who just couldn't afford imatinib because Novartis had a monopoly. And interestingly, it was invoking its monopoly on a secondary patent and on the package insert. So in a way, monopolies don't just work on patents, they can work on copyright in other forms that pharma companies use as tactics. And if you're not watching, it's just drug by drug, vaccine by vaccine, product by product battles that you have to fight. And imatinib is a classic case. We won the battle in India by challenging Novartis's patents, but in many other countries, till 2017 or 18, these monopolies continued. And you can see South Africa prices, like the vaccine, is actually higher than the European Union countries. So, companies have been exploiting intellectual property for a very long time. So the next slide. So what can governments do for C19? And I think India and South Africa showed some foresight. And the next slide, please. Yeah, so India and South Africa showed some foresight. They didn't wait for people to die in large numbers before they came with this proposal. They actually did this work around July last year, presented it to the WTO in September last year, early October last year, and have been seeking a waiver on a number of intellectual property that apply on devices, drugs and vaccines, and that's copyrights, industrial design, patents, and of course, information data, and of course, the enforcement of those rights of intellectual property in their own jurisdiction. So, a member country who would sign up to it would have the flexibility. So if this proposal goes through, where, there's a temporary waiver for the application and the enforcement of intellectual property such as patents, then countries would like South Africa and India and many others would have the flexibility not to enforce intellectual property, not to grant intellectual property, and that would speeden up the process of manufacturing, local manufacturing, particularly with countries who have manufacturing capacities, but also for countries who want to start manufacturing. And I think I wanted to highlight that part of India's decolonization project, as I call it, was not just land. They didn't just redistribute land when we won our freedom. We redistributed the way intellectual property was viewed. And India completely actually changed the rules by doing away with monopolies in food and medicine. And that decolonization project that we had in the 70s has led to a situation today that India is actually self-reliant on just not medicines, but vaccines, and perhaps has access to those vaccines. So if countries really do want to move forward for other pandemics and diseases, they will have to look at formulations of regional and national production. So it's very well to import at this particular point of time in the COVID-19, but I think the future lies in decolonizing intellectual property and moving forward with their own projects on manufacturing, so to speak. So I think in some sense, this offers a great opportunity for countries to start looking at how they can contribute to a global manufacturing, even if it is by making a small product along the supply chain. And I think this is really very crucial. At some point, this whole manufacturing project must start. And in some ways, this project really offers a solution for COVID-19 if therapeutics come along the way in the next couple of years. So the waiver will only be valid till majority of the world population have developed immunity. It's not a permanent waiver, and does not apply to other diseases. So that's what I wanted to say. And the last slide, I think, of course, we have the flexibility to do it. It's part of the World Trade Organization. Marrakesh Treaty allows members to request for a waiver from obligations under exceptional circumstances. It will do no harm to have the waiver in place and not to have to look at all the patterns and enforcement and whether you have the freedom to operate, and so to speak. So the last slide is relating to just next slide. I just wanted to say this, that at this point of time, this is where we are in the supply chain, and we really need to do something about scaling up and meeting the needs of developing countries. Thank you.
Leena, thank you very much. Our last speaker is Fatima Hassan from the Health Justice Institute. Fatima, will you respond in 7 minutes to some of the thoughts that the speakers have shared?
Thanks, Marlies. So I'll try and just give a few reflections, and thanks really to Leena and Zain and Yousuf. I mean, we all go back a long way, and I think none of us ever thought we would have to deal with the situation of self-created scarcity and lack of access and high prices again in our lifetime, but here we are some 20 years later after HIV/AIDS. So I think the first takeaway from me from all the presentations is that what they've shown collectively is that the world still sees medicines as a commodity. And the longer you treat diagnostics and vaccines and medicines, which we call therapeutics, as a commodity, the longer you're going to have a system which prioritizes intellectual property over the ability of many people in the world, both rich and poor, to be able to access life-saving interventions. And I think that's why there's this existential threat to the pharmaceutical industry, which, by the way, is more profitable than the oil and gas industries as well. So it's a highly profitable industry, and I think Zain has reflected some of that in the data in some of his slides around the pricing of particular vaccines and diagnostics as well. So there's this existential threat which is currently being dealt, it's being negotiated in Geneva right now. Yesterday, as you know, activists in South Africa, in India and other parts of the world were writing and protesting at different embassies to ask them to stop blocking the waiver. And the reason why we are supporting the waiver, but why we don't think there's going to be a rapid resolution of that particular request, which is actually being led by South Africa and India. And as you know, our president took very long to actually brief the nation about it or even mention it. He only did that last week, which is slightly surprising and also a bit schizophrenic. But nevertheless, he now has mentioned it. And many countries and the pharmaceutical industry, the international body, has issued a statement saying that they don't see intellectual property as a barrier. They don't see intellectual property as a reason why we're now facing vaccine nationalism or vaccine apartheid, and they don't see patents and intellectual property and exclusivity or patent monopolies as the reason for why we're now facing a different form of nationalism, which is a supply crisis globally. And I think the map that Zain showed quite clearly and colorfully illustrates the access issues that we're going to face over the next 3 years. So Leena is right. We had patent defiance campaigns. We had to challenge the pricing practices of the pharmaceutical industry with HIV/AIDS. But what we never had in this country, like Yousuf said, in 100 years, no compulsory license or state action against pharmaceutical companies on a pharmaceutical product. But even at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, our government never took measures to actually issue a compulsory license against any of these drug manufacturers. And there's many reasons for that we can, some which we can speculate about and some for which we have some data. So we did think it would be different with this pandemic because the crisis it's really, a global crisis. It's hemorrhaging health systems, it's hemorrhaging economies. The longer we wait for access to vaccines, the more variants and mutations we're going to have, the longer it's going to actually meet the goal of global widespread population immunity. And so we had asked already from last year, April, would this be the redeeming moment for government? And it doesn't seem to be that way, except for the TRIPS waiver request. The Patent Amendments Act and the Fix the Patent Laws campaign in South Africa has been saying for years, you need to pass these laws and you need to do it urgently. And instead what our government was doing in our parliament was passing regulations and laws about smoking and about beaches and about alcohol and about whether you could buy open-toe shoes or not. But the real, central crisis around access to something that could actually potentially take you out of this epidemic, which is passing those laws to make it easier so that you wouldn't have to rely on the TRIPS waivers, actually still sitting in parliament and hasn't been passed. Not a single opposition party has also prioritized that, we don't believe. And only so far one political party that's in opposition, the EFF, has said that the vaccine should be treated as a public good. So the DA, for example, has brought cases around transparency around the plan, wants to do its own provincial procurement, but has never once actually mentioned the issue of patent monopolies. And similarly, you'll find the ruling party being very, we believe, fearful of actually taking on pharmaceutical power to the point where they've accepted and agreed on non-disclosure agreements, to the point where the pharmaceutical companies are actually asking for liability exemptions in some of the contracts, which we now believe is being held up for AstraZeneca, for Pfizer, for Johnson & Johnson, etc. So the ecosystem that I think Zain and Yousuf and Leena has explained really, I think, very powerfully, I think explains why we have the supply crisis. Because when you have exclusive monopolies and you have patent protection and you have no challenge of that particular type of monopolistic practices where you rely only on voluntary measures and voluntary actions, this is the reason why we now have a supply crisis. And interestingly, in the last week, the EU faces a massive supply crisis. And now you see two new companies emerging, some of whom are actually rivals of these, normally commercial rivals of these vaccine companies, stepping in and agreeing that they would actually manufacture some of the vaccines for them. So what we often find in this particular kind of context, and we saw this with HIV/AIDS, is a set of double standards. The Netherlands in June last year decided to threaten Roche on some of the diagnostic testing kits around some of the technology and the sharing, and then Roche actually agreed. When the EU faced supply problems, even though they're blocking the waiver, now they are sub-licensees that are actually going to manufacture vaccines for their markets, and they've also responded with an export ban. And I think that these are some of the issues that we need to interrogate. And Leena talked about the patent defiance and our action in the Competition Commission against some of these companies around their pricing practices. Because if your government is in denial, which it was during HIV/AIDS, it's not with COVID, But if it refuses to take any state measures, which it can under the Patents Act as it stands, under our Constitution, under the Investment Act, under Section 4 of the Patents Act, even though it's not yet amended, if your government refuses to take action, then it's left to civil society. And when we took these drug companies, who were the only ones who were manufacturing the first line ARVs, sorry, not second line, what they did was, in order not to share information and not to be transparent about pricing, and this is why we're making an issue about pricing transparency right now, because at that time we had to spend years trying to fight for pricing transparency. As a result, the public and private sector, so it means all of us, people who use both healthcare systems, a lot of out-of-pocket expenses, had to pay different prices and very high prices for ARVs that you could have got a generic version for much cheaper from India. And you all know, I mean, Leena's explained to you how it was that after 1948, when India secured its independence from the British, that it was able to become the pharmaceutical or the pharmacy of the developing world, and that's why we get a lot of our generics as well for some chronic conditions from India. So the issue about price transparency in the current climate is that when you have a patent and a patent monopoly, and you are the only company that can make a particular vaccine, like Moderna, for example, even though the US co-owns it and co-developed it, or AstraZeneca or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, is that there is no price transparency. And when you are the patent holder, you can try and insist that that data is not disclosed. So you can issue a press statement saying, I commit to a low profit price. But when we are seeing different price lists now being circulated and different prices for COVAX, which has a tiered pricing system, potentially different prices for the AU mechanism, which is called AVAT, the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, and then the different bilaterals with the EU, with the US, with Canada, with Australia, with South Africa, with Uganda, we're now getting more and more information that shows very large, often large variations in the different prices. And a monopoly holder or somebody who's been given a patent who doesn't disclose that information, it makes it very hard for you as a, as a civil society grouping to be able to demand that kind of pricing transparency. Governments could, but often they're desperately looking for supplies, and basically we're in a situation where at the moment I think governments is going to pay for pay whatever price is being asked. They're not necessarily going to be negotiating downwards. When you have a monopoly like AstraZeneca and a patent, you can also decide which markets you want to go into and which markets you don't want to go into. And I think Zain explained that quite clearly around the case of Moderna. And so that's what we call market segmentation. You decide which countries you want to go to. You decide which markets you will serve and which markets a sub-licensee like Serum Institute or a company in Korea or Sanofi or Novartis will actually supply. So you start segmenting markets and you deal with this as if it's a car or as if it's a PlayStation, as opposed to it's a medicine. So you don't go into the markets where there's an epidemiological need or where you really need to go into first. You decide which markets make the most sense for your particular shareholders or which markets make the most sense for you from a regulatory, rapid authorization point of view. The contracts then are also not public, they're not transparent. Nobody has seen the non-redacted versions of most of these contracts, including with the COVAX facility in the AU. We've been told they are confidential. In the EU, these agreements have been classified state secrets. I mean, certainly in South Africa, we're being told that they're NDAs. So, let me end there, and we can really open up to questions, I think mainly to the three speakers, because, it's not often that we have them with us, and you can always contact HAI if you have any queries, because you know how to get a hold of us. So I'll stop there, Marlies. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. I'm going to ask the panel for their concluding thoughts, and I'm going to ask them specifically for reflections on the media's role in transparency and intellectual property and some of the issues covered this afternoon, if they have any thoughts specifically on the media's role and any other concluding thoughts. And then I'm going to ask Fatima if she would conclude the seminar with her concluding thoughts before the seminar ends. So I'm going to ask Yousuf, would you like to start us off with your concluding thoughts?
Okay, I'll go. I think that the media has generally been doing a good job in focusing on the issue, particularly of the areas where government has not been, particularly sort of strong. because I hear from some government quarters saying, yeah, either the media only reports these things and so on. The problem, of course, is government's own communications networks are very poorly sort of organized, and the information has just been very sparse. So that's kind of made it difficult. I think there are some very complex issues, and this is a great opportunity where media is here, and we can talk about some of these complex issues. So I think that's where the media will need to be getting up to speed and informing itself of these, because I think they change on a regular basis, and then that information can be relayed in a way that is sort of understandable to the general public. And then the last thing I want to say in relation to media is that recently very little focus has been placed on the failure of government to move forward with the patents amendments and so on. And I think that's an area which is not really new, but needs to be picked up again. The media can actually play a role in, and I must just say here that even if the waiver is approved, we will still have to pass the local legislation to make the waiver effective, right? So that's an added piece to the Patents Laws Amendments Act. And I think the public needs to be made aware that it's fine to make a particular statement in Geneva, but in Pretoria, things are moving in a different kind of direction. And in fact, that almost contradiction needs to be exposed and put pressure on government at that level. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousuf, for that great answer and being so gracious about going first. Zain, would you like to offer some concluding thoughts?
Sure. I think this is a crisis that has shown a spotlight on what is broken about medical innovation and intellectual property. But many of the systematic issues have been there for a long time, and we have seen them with HIV/AIDS, and now with cancer medicines, and now we're seeing with COVID-19. And so I agree completely with Yousuf's comment on the idea that it's really important for governments to take steps at home to realize the promises and commitments that they have made internationally. And it goes for South Africa, but it also goes for the EU. The EU constantly talks about how they want to make the vaccine a global public good, but then they don't share the technology, and then they impose export restrictions, or export controls rather. So there's a gap between rhetoric and reality, and I think the media has a crucial role in exposing that.
Thank you very much, Zain. Leena, do you have any wisdom to share?
Not at this point, but I just wanted to say this, that, when I started to work on pharmaceuticals, that was a big HIV crisis, and then subsequently the hepatitis C. At every point I heard this, that, developing country manufacturers just don't have the capacity. I heard it in trastuzumab, actually. I worked a lot on the biological trastuzumab, and I think the number one question that even the Indian government and all of society asked me was, can an Indian company make trastuzumab? You're asking for the patent waiver, compulsory license, but are you indeed? Where's the proof? Where's the evidence that an Indian company can make trastuzumab? It's a biological drug, extremely complex and difficult to make. And I think this is the way they sort of shake your confidence in the ability of your manufacturing capacity in developing countries. I work with a lot of scientists in India, and we were absolutely sure, looking at the technical capacity within the country on vaccines and other areas of biologicals, that trastuzumab could be produced. And in fact, I think I see this very I would say, a deliberate ploy by some developed countries to raise this issue of capacity, and saying that perhaps you don't have the technology and capacity, even if the intellectual property waiver was put. And I find that very uncomfortable, coming from a developing country which has believed in itself and gone ahead to produce what it needs. I'm in no manner romanticizing the Indian industry, as we can see that there are major problems. But what we did learn is that these questions will be asked every time, whether it's HIV/AIDS or hepatitis C or a cancer drug like trastuzumab, and finally COVID-19. And what we are seeing is some great innovations coming out of South Korea, India, and in Asia, and I think Africa can do it as well. And Latin America also. Argentina is starting to make a lot of drugs, products that actually needed by patients in the UK. So I think it's a question of time, actually, and proper policies that will drive local manufacturing. And for COVID-19, we just need an emergent waiver. And asking the countries that are opposing to questioning those countries would be very interesting for journalists to do, and actually delving into going beyond the obvious question that they pose publicly, is that it's an issue of capacity and technical capacity of developing countries, and to start digging more around those lines. Yeah.
Thank you, Leena. That was great. Fatima, you're the lucky one because you've had the most time to think about the question. Would you like to end off with some concluding comments?
No, I think Leena and Yousuf and Zain have done a brilliant job at explaining all the issues. We are losing some journalists now. So I just, real heartfelt thank you to all of you for being on the panel, and to Marlies for moderating, and Chiwa and Althea for organizing. And thank you all for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you, Leena. Thank you, Zain. Thank you, Yousuf.
Thank you, everybody.